It was the largest and bloodiest front of World War II, a clash of titans that reshaped the fate of the world. The German-Soviet War, also known as the Eastern Front, was a brutal campaign of unimaginable scale. From the frozen streets of Stalingrad to the vast plains of Kursk, millions of soldiers and civilians were caught in a storm of destruction, ideology, and total war. It was not just a battle for land, but a fight for survival between Hitler's invading forces and Stalin's defiant Red Army. In today's video, we uncover the full story of the German-Soviet War, its origins, its horrors, and the legacy it left behind. The German-Soviet War, a devastating chapter in human history, unfolded against the backdrop of a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. Its roots can be traced back to the complex interplay of ideological, political, and military factors that had been simmering beneath the surface for decades. At its core, this conflict was a collision of two diametrically opposed systems: Nazi Germany's aggressive expansionism and the Soviet Union's revolutionary communism, each driven by visions of dominance and survival. To understand the origins of this war, one must delve into the intricate web of alliances, betrayals, and miscalculations that set the stage for what would become one of the bloodiest confrontations in modern history. In the aftermath of World War I, both Germany and the Soviet Union emerged as nations grappling with profound internal and external challenges. Germany, stripped of its territories and burdened by reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, seethed with resentment and sought to reclaim its status as a great power. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, born out of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, faced isolation and economic hardship as it attempted to consolidate its socialist experiment amidst a hostile capitalist world. Despite their ideological differences, these two powers found themselves drawn together in the early 1920s through the Treaty of Rapallo, an agreement that allowed them to bypass Western sanctions and engage in clandestine military cooperation. This uneasy partnership laid the groundwork for future interactions, but also underscored the deep mistrust that characterized their relationship. By the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany had transformed the geopolitical equation. Nazi ideology, rooted in racial supremacy and Lebensraum, living space, viewed the Soviet Union as both an existential threat and a land ripe for conquest. For Hitler, the vast resources of Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine's fertile plains and the Caucasus oil fields, were essential to sustaining Germany's war machine and fulfilling his vision of an Aryan empire. Meanwhile, Joseph Stalin, who had consolidated his grip on the Soviet Union through brutal purges and industrialization campaigns, perceived the growing militarization of Nazi Germany with increasing alarm. Yet, he also harbored ambitions to expand Soviet influence and secure buffer zones in Eastern Europe, leading to a delicate balancing act between deterrence and appeasement. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 marked a turning point in this fraught dynamic. Signed just days before the outbreak of World War II, this non-aggression agreement stunned the world by bringing Germany and the Soviet Union into a temporary alliance. On the surface, it appeared to guarantee mutual neutrality and divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. However, beneath the veneer of cooperation lay a ticking time bomb. For Hitler, the pact was merely a tactical maneuver, a way to secure his eastern flank while he focused on conquering Western Europe. For Stalin, it offered a brief reprieve to bolster Soviet defenses and prepare for an inevitable confrontation. Both leaders understood that the pact was not a permanent solution, but rather a prelude to a larger showdown. As tensions mounted in the years leading up to the invasion, the geopolitical chessboard became increasingly volatile. Hitler's rapid victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries emboldened him to pursue his long-standing ambition of crushing Bolshevism. By early 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, was already taking shape. Despite warnings from intelligence agencies and diplomatic channels about Germany's intentions, Stalin remained skeptical, believing that Hitler would not risk a two-front war so soon after defeating Britain. This fatal miscalculation left the Soviet Union woefully unprepared for the onslaught that was to come. Thus, the German-Soviet War did not erupt in a vacuum. It was the culmination of years of ideological rivalry, strategic maneuvering, and mutual suspicion. As the storm clouds gathered over Eastern Europe, the stage was set for a conflict that would reshape the continent and leave an indelible mark on the collective memory of humanity. The decisions made by leaders in Berlin and Moscow during this critical period, not only their actions but also their failures to act, would determine the course of millions of lives and the fate of empires. In the chapters that follow, we will explore how this war unfolded, examining its battles, its consequences, and its enduring legacy in the annals of history. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. While ostensibly a diplomatic triumph for both Germany and the Soviet Union, was riddled with contradictions that foreshadowed the inevitable clash between the two powers. At its heart, the agreement was a marriage of convenience born out of necessity rather than trust. For Hitler, the pact served as a temporary shield, allowing him to focus his military resources on Western Europe without fear of Soviet interference. For Stalin, it provided an opportunity to expand Soviet influence in Eastern Europe under the guise of neutrality, securing territories such as Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania. Yet, the ideological chasm between Nazism and communism ensured that this uneasy alliance could not endure. One of the most significant consequences of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was the division of Poland. In September 1939, following Germany's invasion from the west, the Soviet Union launched its own offensive from the east, effectively partitioning the country between the two powers. This coordinated aggression shocked the world and set a precedent for the brutal realpolitik that would define the early years of World War II. For the people of Poland, the occupation brought unimaginable suffering, as both Nazi and Soviet forces implemented policies of repression, deportation, and mass execution. The Katyn massacre, in which thousands of Polish officers were executed by the Soviet secret police, NKVD, became a symbol of the horrors inflicted upon the nation during this period. Beyond Poland, the pact also facilitated Soviet expansion into the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Bessarabia, a region of Romania. These annexations were justified by Moscow as necessary measures to protect the Soviet Union from potential threats, but they were widely seen as acts of imperial ambition. The incorporation of these territories into the Soviet sphere of influence further strained relations with Western powers and deepened suspicions about Stalin's long-term intentions. While the Soviet leader may have believed he was strengthening his nation's defenses, his actions only fueled perceptions of Soviet opportunism and aggression. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler's strategic calculus was evolving. By mid-1940, Germany had achieved stunning victories in Western Europe, defeating France in a matter of weeks and forcing Britain to retreat across the English Channel. With no immediate threat on the Western Front, Hitler turned his attention eastward, where he saw both an opportunity and a challenge. The Soviet Union, with its vast resources and sprawling landmass, represented a tantalizing prize for the Third Reich. However, it also posed a formidable obstacle, one that Hitler viewed through the lens of racial ideology. To him, the conquest of the Soviet Union was not merely a military objective. It was a crusade against Bolshevism, which he equated with Jewish influence, and a means of securing Lebensraum for the German people. Planning for Operation Barbarossa began in earnest in late 1940, named after Frederick Barbarossa, the medieval Holy Roman Emperor who led a failed crusade to the east. The operation reflected Hitler's grandiose vision of subjugating Eastern Europe and reshaping it in Germany's image. The plan called for a massive blitzkrieg-style assault involving 3 army groups, north, center, and south, that would encircle and destroy Soviet forces in rapid succession. Key objectives included capturing Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine, which were seen as critical to crippling the Soviet war effort and exploiting the region's economic potential. However, the decision to invade the Soviet Union was fraught with risks. Chief among them was the prospect of a prolonged conflict on multiple fronts, a scenario that had historically proven disastrous for Germany. Moreover, the Wehrmacht's logistical capabilities were stretched thin, and the harsh climate of Eastern Europe posed significant challenges. Despite these concerns, Hitler remained convinced that the Red Army was weak and demoralized. Thanks in part to Stalin's purges of the military leadership in the late 1930s, he believed that a swift and decisive campaign would bring about the collapse of the Soviet state before winter set in. On the Soviet side, Stalin's response to the growing threat was marked by a mix of denial and preparation. Intelligence reports from sources such as Richard Sorik, a Soviet spy operating in Tokyo, repeatedly warned of an impending German attack. Yet, Stalin dismissed these warnings, fearing they might be provocations designed to draw the Soviet Union into a premature conflict. His reluctance to mobilize fully or adopt a defensive posture left the Red Army dangerously unprepared when the invasion finally came. At the same time, however, Stalin did take steps to bolster Soviet defenses, including relocating key industries eastward and stockpiling supplies. These measures, though insufficient to prevent initial setbacks, would prove crucial in sustaining the Soviet war effort in the months and years ahead. As spring turned to summer in 1941, the signs of an impending German invasion grew increasingly ominous. Troop movements along the border, increased aerial reconnaissance, and intercepted communications all pointed to an imminent attack. Yet, even as late as June 21, the eve of the invasion, Stalin clung to the hope that diplomacy could avert disaster. That night, reports of German soldiers cutting barbed wire and advancing toward Soviet positions prompted frantic appeals for clarification from Moscow. But it was too late. At dawn on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa commenced, unleashing the full fury of the Wehrmacht upon the Soviet Union. The opening stages of the invasion caught the Red Army off guard, leading to catastrophic losses in men and material. Entire divisions were encircled and annihilated, while cities and towns fell like dominoes under the weight of the German advance. The speed and scale of the assault exceeded even Hitler's expectations, raising hopes of a quick victory. But as the weeks turned into months, the resilience of the Soviet people and the vastness of their territory began to take their toll. What had seemed like a straightforward campaign soon devolved into a grueling struggle that would test the limits of both nations. In retrospect, the events leading up to the German-Soviet War reveal a tragic sequence of miscalculations and missed opportunities. Hitler's hubris blinded him to the dangers of overextending his forces, while Stalin's paranoia prevented him from taking decisive action until it was almost too late. Together, these failures set the stage for one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. A war that would claim millions of lives and reshape the global order in ways neither leader could have foreseen. The dawn of June 22, 1941, marked the beginning of one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. At 3:15 a.m., as the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. With over 3 million troops, 600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 700 aircraft, the Wehrmacht unleashed a blitzkrieg-style assault across an unknown, 800-mile-long front. The sheer scale of the operation was unprecedented, dwarfing even the German invasions of Poland and France. For Adolf Hitler, this was not merely a military endeavor but a crusade, a war of annihilation against Bolshevism and the Slavic peoples he deemed racially inferior. Yet, despite the meticulous planning and overwhelming force at his disposal, the campaign would soon reveal itself to be as much a gamble as it was a strategy. Operation Barbarossa was divided into 3 primary thrusts, each led by a distinct army group with specific objectives. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, aimed to capture Leningrad, now Petersburg, the cultural and industrial heart of the Soviet Union. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, targeted Moscow, the political and administrative capital. Meanwhile, Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Gerber von Rundstedt, sought to seize Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, along with its rich agricultural resources and vital oil fields. This tripartite approach reflected Hitler's dual priorities: securing strategic cities while exploiting the economic wealth of the conquered territories. From the outset, the Germans achieved remarkable success. The element of surprise played a crucial role. As the Red Army had been caught unprepared, Stalin's reluctance to mobilize fully or adopt a defensive posture left Soviet forces scattered and disorganized. Many units were stationed too close to the border, making them vulnerable to encirclement. Within hours of the invasion, German bombers struck key infrastructure, including airfields, railways, and communication hubs, crippling the Soviet ability to respond effectively. Entire divisions were wiped out in chaotic engagements, and thousands of Soviet soldiers surrendered without putting up significant resistance. By the end of the first week, the Wehrmacht had advanced deep into Soviet territory, capturing major cities such as Vilnius, Minsk, and Lviv. The encirclement battles that followed became hallmarks of the early stages of the campaign. In the Battle of Bialystok-Minsk alone, nearly 300,000 Soviet troops were captured, and vast quantities of equipment were destroyed or abandoned. The rapid collapse of Soviet defenses seemed to vindicate Hitler's belief that the Red Army was weak and incapable of mounting a sustained resistance. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to appear in the German plan. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union was rooted in both ideological fervor and pragmatic considerations. From an ideological standpoint, the campaign represented the culmination of Nazi racial theory. which viewed Slavs as subhuman and Bolshevism as a Jewish conspiracy. Hitler envisioned the conquest of Eastern Europe as a means of creating Lebensraum, living space, for the Aryan race. The fertile plains of Ukraine, the forests of Belarus, and the industrial centers of Western Russia were to be colonized and repopulated by Germans, while the native populations would either be exterminated or reduced to serfdom. Pragmatically, the invasion was driven by Germany's need for resources. By mid-1941, the Third Reich faced growing shortages of raw materials, particularly oil, rubber, and grain. Control of the Soviet Union's vast reserves promised to alleviate these constraints and sustain the war effort indefinitely. Furthermore, defeating the Soviet Union would eliminate the last major continental power capable of challenging German hegemony in Europe. Hitler believed that a swift victory would force Britain to sue for peace, thereby ending the war on terms favorable to Germany. To achieve these goals, the German High Command devised a strategy centered on speed and decisiveness. Blitzkrieg tactics, which had proven so effective in Western Europe, were adapted to the vast expanses of the Eastern Front. Armored spearheads would penetrate deep into Soviet territory, bypassing strong points and cutting off retreating enemy forces. Infantry divisions would follow, mopping up pockets of resistance and consolidating gains. Air superiority, provided by the Luftwaffe, was intended to paralyze Soviet command and control, ensuring that the Red Army could not mount coordinated counterattacks. However, the strategy also contained inherent risks. The sheer size of the Soviet Union meant that supply lines would stretch thin, rendering the Wehrmacht increasingly vulnerable to logistical bottlenecks. Moreover, the campaign timeline assumed that the Red Army would collapse within weeks, allowing German forces to reach their objectives before winter set in. Any delay in achieving decisive results could expose the invaders to the harsh conditions of the Russian winter, a factor that had historically doomed foreign armies attempting to conquer the region. In the initial months of the invasion, the German offensive appeared unstoppable. The combination of superior training, equipment, and leadership gave the Wehrmacht a decisive edge over its Soviet counterparts. Panzer divisions, supported by mechanized infantry and dive bombers, executed lightning-fast maneuvers that repeatedly outflanked and overwhelmed Red Army units. Key victories during this period underscored the effectiveness of German tactics and the disarray within Soviet ranks. One of the most notable achievements was the encirclement of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. In late August, Army Group South launched a pincer movement that trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in what became known as the Battle of Kiev. Over 600,000 prisoners were taken, marking one of the largest surrenders in military history. The fall of Kiev not only secured Ukraine's agricultural wealth, but also paved the way for further advances toward the Caucasus and the Black Sea. Similarly, Army Group Center made steady progress toward Moscow, capturing Smolensk in July, after another devastating encirclement battle. By September, German forces stood less than 200 miles from the Soviet capital, seemingly poised to deliver the knockout blow. The rapid advance fueled optimism in Berlin, where many believed the war in the East would be over by Christmas. Yet, despite these successes, the campaign began to encounter difficulties that hinted at trouble ahead. The vast distances involved required constant resupply, placing immense strain on German logistics. Roads turned to mud during the autumn rains, slowing the advance and hampering mobility. Partisan activity behind German lines disrupted communications and supply routes, forcing commanders to divert resources to maintain order. Most critically, the Red Army, though battered, refused to capitulate. Reinforcements poured in from the eastern regions of the Soviet Union, bolstering depleted units and enabling localized counterattacks. As the summer wore on, the limitations of the German strategy became increasingly apparent. One of the most pressing issues was the lack of adequate preparation for the unique challenges of the Eastern Front. Unlike in Western Europe, where well-developed infrastructure facilitated rapid movement, the Soviet Union's primitive road network and sparse rail system hindered the Wehrmacht's ability to sustain its momentum. Fuel shortages plagued armored units, while food and ammunition supplies dwindled as the distance from depots increased. Compounding these logistical woes was the Soviet Union's scorched earth policy. As German forces advanced, they found themselves confronted with empty villages, demolished bridges, and burned crops. This deliberate destruction denied the invaders access to local resources, forcing them to rely entirely on supplies brought from Germany. While effective in slowing the German advance, the scorched earth tactic also inflicted immense suffering on the civilian population, further intensifying the brutality of the conflict. Another challenge was the resilience of the Red Army. Although poorly led and inadequately equipped at the start of the campaign, Soviet forces gradually adapted to the realities of modern warfare. Under the leadership of figures such as Georgy Zhukov, who emerged as one of the war's most capable commanders, the Red Army began to implement more flexible defensive strategies. Mobile reserve formations were created to plug gaps in the line, while partisan units harassed German rear areas. These measures, though insufficient to halt the invasion outright, succeeded in buying precious time for the Soviet Union to rebuild its strength. Perhaps the greatest obstacle, however, was the weather. As autumn approached, the rains transformed the landscape into a quagmire, bogging down vehicles and rendering roads impassable, known as the Rasputsa, or mud season. This phenomenon severely hampered German operations and delayed the final push toward Moscow. When winter arrived earlier than expected, temperatures plummeted to levels that caught the ill-prepared Wehrmacht completely off guard. Troops lacked proper winter clothing, and equipment froze in the bitter cold, compounding the difficulties of maintaining momentum. By the end of 1941, Operation Barbarossa had achieved remarkable successes but fallen short of its ultimate objectives. The Wehrmacht had inflicted staggering losses on the Red Army, capturing vast swaths of territory and inflicting untold suffering on the Soviet people. Yet, the dream of a quick and decisive victory remained elusive. Instead, the campaign had evolved into a protracted struggle that tested the endurance of both sides. For Germany, the failure to capture Moscow and the onset of winter signaled the beginning of a long and grueling conflict, one that would ultimately prove fatal to the Third Reich. For the Soviet Union, the survival of its state and the preservation of its people depended on their ability to withstand the storm and fight back with renewed determination. The Battle of Moscow, fought between October 1941 and January 1942, stands as one of the pivotal moments in the German-Soviet War. It was here that the myth of Nazi invincibility began to crumble, and the resilience of the Soviet Union was put on full display. For Adolf Hitler, capturing Moscow, the political, administrative, and symbolic heart of the Soviet Union, was the ultimate prize. Yet, despite the Wehrmacht's initial successes and their proximity to the city, the battle would ultimately prove to be a catastrophic failure for Germany. The combination of logistical challenges, harsh weather conditions, and the tenacity of Soviet resistance not only halted the German advance, but also marked the first major turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. By late September 1941, Army Group Center had pushed deep into Soviet territory, reaching positions within striking distance of Moscow. The city loomed large in Hitler's strategic vision, both as a symbol of Soviet power and as a hub for rail networks and industrial production. Capturing it would deal a crippling blow to the Red Army's morale and logistics, potentially forcing Stalin to sue for peace. To achieve this goal, Hitler ordered Operation Typhoon, a massive offensive aimed at encircling and destroying Soviet forces defending the capital before advancing into the city itself. Operation Typhoon commenced on October 2, 1941, with overwhelming force, over 1 million German troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, launched a multi-pronged assault designed to cut off Soviet reinforcements and isolate Moscow. In the opening days of the operation, German armored divisions achieved significant breakthroughs, surrounding and annihilating large numbers of Soviet troops near Vyazma and Bryansk. By mid-October, the Wehrmacht had advanced to within 60 miles of Moscow, raising hopes in Berlin that victory was imminent. However, the closer the Germans came to Moscow, the more evident the cracks in their strategy became. The rapid pace of the advance had stretched supply lines to the breaking point, leaving frontline units increasingly reliant on captured Soviet stocks for sustenance and fuel. Roads deteriorated under the weight of constant traffic, while the onset of autumn rains turned fields and pathways into seas of mud, known as the Rasputiza, or quagmire season. This phenomenon severely hampered mobility, slowing the German advance to a crawl. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies during the early stages of Barbarossa, found itself constrained by worsening weather and growing Soviet air defenses. Despite these setbacks, the Wehrmacht pressed forward. By early November, German reconnaissance units reported glimpses of Moscow's skyline, sparking jubilation among commanders who believed the end was near. But as winter approached, the situation grew increasingly dire. Temperatures plummeted to unprecedented lows, with thermometers registering 40 degrees Celsius, -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Ill-prepared for such conditions, German soldiers suffered from frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion. Vehicles froze solid, weapons malfunctioned, and ammunition became scarce. The once mighty blitzkrieg had devolved into a grinding slog, with every mile gained coming at immense cost. While the Germans struggled against nature and logistics, the Soviets were busy preparing for what would become one of the most determined defensive campaigns in military history. Realizing the existential threat posed by the German advance, Joseph Stalin issued a desperate call for reinforcements from across the Soviet Union. Factories east of the Ural Mountains ramped up production, churning out tanks, planes, and artillery pieces at an astonishing rate. Entire divisions were hastily assembled and transported to the front, bolstering the depleted ranks of the Red Army. A key figure in organizing the Soviet defense was General Georgy Zhukov, who had been recalled from Leningrad to take command of the Western Front. A master tactician with a reputation for ruthlessness, Zhukov implemented a series of measures designed to stabilize the situation around Moscow. He ordered the construction of multiple defensive belts, consisting of trenches, bunkers, and minefields to slow the German advance. Civilians, including women and children, were mobilized to dig fortifications and assist in the war effort. At the same time, Zhukov orchestrated a series of counterattacks using newly arrived Siberian divisions, whose experience fighting in cold climates proved invaluable. One of the most critical factors in the Soviet defense was the arrival of fresh troops from the Far East. In a calculated gamble, Stalin had withdrawn elite units stationed along the Manchurian border. After receiving intelligence that Japan, Germany's nominal ally, had no intention of attacking the Soviet Union, these reinforcements, hardened by years of training in sub-zero temperatures, brought much-needed strength and resolve to the beleaguered defenders. Equipped with white camouflage uniforms and skis, they launched surprise attacks against frozen and disoriented German units, inflicting heavy casualties and sowing confusion behind enemy lines. As December approached, the balance of power began to shift decisively in favor of the Soviets. On December 5, 1941, Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive involving over 1 million troops, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, codenamed Operation Jupiter. The assault caught the exhausted and demoralized Germans completely off guard. Soviet forces struck along multiple axes, targeting weak points in the German line and exploiting gaps created by overstretched supply chains. Within days, the Wehrmacht was forced into retreat, abandoning hard-won gains and retreating westward to avoid encirclement. The ferocity of the Soviet counterattack stunned German commanders, who had assumed that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse. Instead, they found themselves facing a rejuvenated and highly motivated foe. Soviet tank brigades, led by T-34s renowned for their speed and armor-piercing capabilities, spearheaded the advance, rolling over German positions with impunity. Infantry units, emboldened by their recent successes, pursued retreating enemies with relentless determination. Even partisan fighters, operating in small groups behind German lines, contributed to the chaos by sabotaging supply depots and ambushing isolated patrols. By mid-January 1942, the Germans had been pushed back to a line roughly 100-250 kilometers, 60-155 miles west of Moscow. The capital was saved, and with it, the Soviet Union's ability to continue the fight. For the first time since the start of Barbarossa, the initiative lay firmly in Soviet hands. The failure to capture Moscow dealt a devastating blow to German morale and exposed the limitations of Hitler's grandiose plans for the Eastern Front. The Battle of Moscow had profound implications for both sides. For Germany, the defeat shattered the illusion of swift victory and underscored the dangers of overextending their forces. The Wehrmacht, already stretched thin across a vast theater of operations, now faced the prospect of a prolonged and costly war of attrition. Morale among German troops plummeted, exacerbated by the harsh conditions and mounting losses. Moreover, the failure to secure Moscow weakened Hitler's authority within the high command, leading to increased friction between him and his generals over strategic priorities. For the Soviet Union, the successful defense of Moscow represented a triumph of willpower and organization. It demonstrated that the Red Army, though battered and bruised, could adapt and prevail against seemingly insurmountable odds. The victory boosted civilian morale and reinforced Stalin's grip on power, silencing critics who had questioned his leadership during the darkest days of the invasion. Internationally, the battle signaled to Britain and the United States that the Soviet Union was a vital partner in the fight against Nazi Germany. paving the way for greater cooperation and material support through programs like Lend-Lease. The Battle of Moscow offered important lessons for both sides. For the Germans, it highlighted the perils of underestimating the enemy and neglecting logistical planning. The assumption that the Red Army would collapse quickly proved disastrously wrong, as did the reliance on captured supplies and inadequate winter equipment. Moving forward, German commanders would need to adopt a more cautious approach, prioritizing consolidation and sustainability over bold but risky advances. For the Soviets, the battle underscored the importance of preparation, coordination, and resilience. The mobilization of resources, the integration of partisan warfare, and the deployment of specialized units adapted to extreme conditions all played crucial roles in turning the tide. Future operations would build on these successes, refining tactics and strategies that would eventually lead to the liberation of occupied territories and the collapse of Nazi Germany. The Battle of Moscow was more than just a military engagement. It was a testament to human endurance and the indomitable spirit of a nation fighting for its survival. Against all odds, the Soviet Union managed to repel the mightiest invasion in history, preserving not only its capital but also its hope for ultimate victory. As the snow melted and spring returned to the Eastern Front, the stage was set for a new phase of the war, one in which the Red Army would gradually seize the initiative and drive the invaders back toward Berlin. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but the lessons of Moscow ensured that the Soviet Union would never again be caught unprepared. The Siege of Leningrad, one of the most harrowing episodes of the German-Soviet War, stands as a testament to human endurance in the face of unimaginable suffering. Lasting from September 8, 1941, to January 27, 1944, a staggering 87 days. The siege was not merely a military operation, but a deliberate campaign of starvation and destruction aimed at breaking the will of the Soviet people. For the citizens of Leningrad, the ordeal tested the limits of survival, transforming their city into a symbol of resilience and defiance against Nazi aggression. This chapter delves into the origins, conduct, and consequences of the siege, exploring how it unfolded, the strategy employed by both sides, and the enduring legacy of this catastrophic event. Leningrad, formerly known as St. Petersburg, held immense strategic and symbolic value for both Germany and the Soviet Union. As the second largest city in the USSR and a major industrial and cultural center, it was a linchpin of Soviet power in the northwest. Its proximity to Finland and Estonia made it a gateway to the Baltic Sea, while its rail connections linked it to Moscow and other key regions. For Hitler, capturing Leningrad was part of a broader plan to secure the northern flank of Operation Barbarossa and establish control over the Baltic states. Moreover, the city's historical significance as the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution made it a prime target for destruction, symbolizing the annihilation of communism itself. Hitler's directive to Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, was clear: isolate Leningrad, starve its population into submission, and then raze it to the ground. Unlike other cities targeted during Barbarossa, Leningrad was not intended to be occupied but rather obliterated. This genocidal intent underscored the ideological fervor driving the Nazi war machine and set the stage for one of the most brutal sieges in modern history. The encirclement of Leningrad began in late August 1941, as German and Finnish forces converged on the city from the south and north, respectively. By September 8, the Wehrmacht had severed the last land connection to the outside world, cutting off supply routes and trapping approximately 3 million civilians and soldiers within the city. What followed was a prolonged ordeal marked by artillery bombardments, aerial bombings, and an unrelenting blockade designed to choke the life out of Leningrad. From the outset, the defenders faced overwhelming odds. The Red Army's initial attempts to break the encirclement were thwarted by superior German firepower and coordination. The Sinyavino offensive in late 1941, for example, ended in failure, leaving the city even more isolated, with no access to food, fuel, or medical supplies. Conditions inside Leningrad deteriorated rapidly. The winter of 1941-1942 proved particularly devastating, as temperatures plummeted and resources dwindled to critical levels. Starvation became rampant, with daily bread rations reduced to as little as 125 grams per person, barely enough to sustain life. For the residents of Leningrad, survival became an all-consuming struggle. Families burned furniture, books, and floorboards to stay warm, while public buildings were stripped bare for firewood. Factories continued operating despite the lack of electricity and raw materials, producing munitions and other essential goods under dire circumstances. Yet, the most pervasive threat was hunger, which claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Corpses lay uncollected in the streets, and stories of cannibalism emerged as desperation reached its peak. Despite these horrors, the spirit of resistance endured. Cultural institutions such as the Hermitage Museum and the Philharmonic Orchestra remained active, offering solace and inspiration to those clinging to hope. The famous performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7, broadcast across the city during the height of the siege, served as a powerful reminder of humanity's capacity to create beauty amid devastation. Ordinary citizens also played a crucial role in defending Leningrad, volunteering for civil defense duties, digging trenches, and manning anti-aircraft batteries. Amid the despair, a lifeline emerged in the form of Lake Ladoga, a vast freshwater body to the east of the city. During the winter months, when the lake froze over, a precarious ice road known as the Road of Life, Doroga Zhizny, was established. Trucks carrying food, medicine, and ammunition braved treacherous conditions to reach the besieged population, while evacuees fled westward in search of safety. Although the Road of Life saved countless lives, it came at great cost. Many vehicles sank through weak ice or were targeted by German aircraft. In the spring and summer, when the ice melted, convoys of barges and small boats transported supplies across the lake. These efforts, though heroic, were insufficient to meet the needs of the entire population. Nevertheless, they provided a glimmer of hope and demonstrated the determination of the Soviet government to hold on to Leningrad at any cost. While the civilian population endured unimaginable hardships, Soviet military forces worked tirelessly to lift the siege. Throughout 1942 and 1943, a series of offensives sought to break the encirclement and restore supply lines. One notable effort was the Luban offensive, launched in early 1942, which aimed to link up with trapped Soviet divisions near the Volkhov River. Though ultimately unsuccessful, the operation inflicted significant casualties on the Germans and diverted resources away from other fronts. The turning point came in January 1943, when the Red Army launched Operation Iskra, Spark, a meticulously planned assault designed to punch through the German lines along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. After weeks of intense fighting, Soviet troops succeeded in establishing a narrow corridor connecting Leningrad to the mainland. While the corridor was vulnerable and frequently contested, it allowed for the resumption of regular supply deliveries and significantly improved morale within the city. Building on this success, the Red Army launched a massive offensive in January 1944, codenamed Operation January Thunderstorm. Supported by heavy artillery and air power, Soviet forces overwhelmed German defenses, forcing them to retreat beyond the pre-siege boundaries. On January 27, 1944, the siege was officially declared lifted, marking a triumph of Soviet perseverance and military ingenuity. The siege of Leningrad exacted a staggering human toll. Estimates suggest that between 800,000 and 1.5 million people perished during the blockade, the majority succumbing to starvation, disease, and exposure. Entire families were wiped out, and the psychological scars lingered long after the guns fell silent. Yet, the survivors carried with them a profound sense of pride and unity, forged in the crucible of adversity. The siege also left an indelible mark on Soviet culture and collective memory. Writers, artists, and filmmakers drew inspiration from the experience, creating works that celebrated the heroism of ordinary citizens and condemned the barbarity of the Nazi regime. Memorials and museums, dedicated to the siege, serve as poignant reminders of the sacrifices made by the people of Leningrad. Strategically, the siege highlighted the resilience of the Soviet Union and its ability to endure seemingly insurmountable challenges. For Germany, the failure to capture Leningrad represented a missed opportunity to secure the northern flank of Barbarossa and divert resources to other theaters. Instead, Army Group North remained bogged down in static warfare, tying up valuable manpower and equipment that could have been used elsewhere. The siege of Leningrad exemplifies the intersection of military strategy, human suffering, and moral courage. It was a battle not just for territory, but for the soul of a nation. Through sheer willpower and solidarity, the people of Leningrad defied the odds, refusing to surrender even in the darkest hours. Their story serves as a powerful reminder of the strength of the human spirit and the lengths to which individuals will go to protect their homes, their families, and their future. As we move forward in our narrative, the lessons of Leningrad will continue to resonate, shaping the trajectory of the war and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The year 1942 marked a critical phase in the German-Soviet War, as both sides adapted to the evolving dynamics of the conflict. For Nazi Germany, the failure to capture Moscow in 1941 necessitated a recalibration of strategy. Instead of pursuing a broad front advance aimed at simultaneous objectives, Hitler opted for a more focused approach, concentrating on securing key economic resources in the southern Soviet Union. This shift culminated in the launch of Case Blue Fallblau, an ambitious campaign targeting the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial hub of Stalingrad. Meanwhile, the Red Army, having survived the initial onslaught of Barbarossa, began to regroup and counterattack with increasing effectiveness. The result was a year defined by dramatic swings in momentum, as the Germans achieved significant territorial gains but ultimately overextended themselves, setting the stage for their eventual downfall. By early 1942, it was clear that the Wehrmacht could no longer sustain the rapid advances of 1941. The harsh Russian winter had inflicted heavy losses on German forces, while the vast distances and logistical challenges of the Eastern Front strained their already overstretched supply lines. Recognizing the need for a new approach, Hitler shifted his focus from capturing major cities like Moscow to exploiting the Soviet Union's economic vulnerabilities. Control of the Caucasus region, rich in oil reserves, and the Volga River corridor, vital for transportation and industry, became paramount. Case Blue, launched on June 28, 1942, represented this revised strategy. The operation called for two primary thrusts, one spearheaded by Army Group A toward the Caucasus and another led by Army Group B along the Don River toward Stalingrad. These objectives were intended to cripple the Soviet war effort by depriving it of essential resources and cutting off communication routes between Eastern and Western Russia. However, the plan also reflected Hitler's tendency to micromanage military operations, often prioritizing symbolic victories over strategic coherence. His obsession with capturing Stalingrad, a city named after his arch-enemy Joseph Stalin, would prove particularly costly. In the opening stages of Case Blue, the Wehrmacht once again demonstrated its tactical prowess. Spearheaded by elite panzer divisions, German forces achieved rapid breakthroughs, encircling and annihilating large numbers of Soviet troops near Voronezh and Rostov-on-Don. By late July, Army Group A had advanced deep into the Caucasus, capturing key cities such as Maikop and threatening Grozny, another major oil center. Simultaneously, Army Group B pushed eastward along the Don River, reaching the outskirts of Stalingrad by mid-August. Despite these successes, cracks began to appear in the German offensive. The vast distances involved forced Army Groups A and B to operate independently, stretching their supply lines perilously thin. Moreover, the terrain of the Caucasus posed unique challenges, with rugged mountains and dense forests impeding the mobility of armored units. As German forces ventured deeper into hostile territory, they encountered fierce resistance from Soviet partisans and irregular fighters, who disrupted communications and ambushed supply convoys. Perhaps most critically, the decision to split the offensive between two widely separated objectives diluted the Wehrmacht's strength. While Army Group A struggled to secure the oil fields, Army Group B became bogged down in urban combat around Stalingrad. This division of effort left neither force strong enough to achieve decisive results, allowing the Soviets to exploit weaknesses in the German line. The fight for Stalingrad quickly evolved into one of the most brutal and iconic battles of the war. Located on the western bank of the Volga River, the city was not only a vital transportation hub, but also a symbol of Soviet defiance. Its capture would deal a severe blow to Soviet morale and provide the Germans with a foothold on the critical waterway. Yet, for all its strategic importance, Stalingrad's true significance lay in the ferocity of the struggle that unfolded within its streets. As German forces entered the city in late August 1942, they found themselves engaged in a grueling battle of attrition. The Red Army, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, adopted a strategy of hugging the enemy, keeping Soviet and German positions so close together that German air superiority and artillery support became less effective. Street by street, house by house, the fighting devolved into savage hand-to-hand combat, with soldiers and civilians alike caught in the crossfire. Conditions inside Stalingrad were apocalyptic. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble by relentless bombing and shelling, forcing defenders to take refuge in basements and sewers. Supplies dwindled, and casualties mounted on both sides. Yet, the Soviets refused to yield. Drawing inspiration from Stalin's infamous Order No. 227, which declared, "Not one step, deserters faced execution," and reinforcements poured into the city via precarious crossings of the Volga River, ensuring that the defense remained tenacious. While the Germans focused on capturing Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command quietly prepared a massive counteroffensive, codenamed Operation Uranus. The plan called for a double envelopment of Army Group B by attacking its weaker Romanian and Italian allies guarding the flanks. Launched on November 19, 1942, the operation caught the Axis forces completely off guard. Within days, Soviet armies had broken through the thinly held lines, linking up near Kalach, and encircling approximately 300,000 German and Allied troops inside the Stalingrad pocket. Trapped and cut off from supplies, the Sixth Army, commanded by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, faced mounting desperation. Despite repeated attempts to break the encirclement and Hitler's insistence that the army hold its ground, the situation grew increasingly dire. Starvation, frostbite, and disease claimed thousands of lives, while Soviet artillery and air attacks inflicted further devastation. On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered, marking the first time in history that a field marshal of the Wehrmacht had capitulated. The loss of the Sixth Army was a catastrophic blow to Germany, both militarily and psychologically. The events of 1942 had profound implications for the course of the war. For Germany, the failure of Case Blue exposed the limitations of its resources and leadership. The decision to divide forces between the Caucasus and Stalingrad proved disastrous, leaving neither objective fully secured. The subsequent encirclement and destruction of the Sixth Army shattered the myth of German invincibility and drained the Reich of irreplaceable manpower and equipment. Morale plummeted, and dissent within the high command grew louder, as generals questioned Hitler's judgment and interference in military matters. For the Soviet Union, 1942 represented a turning point in the war. The successful defense of Stalingrad and the implementation of Operation Uranus demonstrated the Red Army's growing confidence and capability. The victory boosted civilian morale and solidified Stalin's authority, reinforcing his image as the architect of Soviet resistance. Internationally, the triumph at Stalingrad bolstered Allied resolve, strengthening cooperation between the USSR, Britain, and the United States. It also underscored the importance of continued material support through programs like Lend-Lease, which provided critical aid to the Soviet war effort. Both sides emerged from 1942 with valuable lessons that shaped their strategies moving forward. For Germany, the overextension of forces highlighted the need for greater flexibility and coordination. Future campaigns would emphasize shorter, more achievable objectives rather than grandiose plans requiring unsustainable levels of commitment. Additionally, the experience of urban warfare in Stalingrad underscored the importance of specialized training and equipment for close-quarters combat. For the Soviets, the success of Operation Uranus validated the use of encirclement tactics and the exploitation of weak points in the enemy line. The integration of partisan warfare, deception, and surprise also proved highly effective, providing a template for future operations. Most importantly, the Red Army's ability to adapt and innovate signaled its transformation from a beleaguered force into a formidable adversary capable of seizing the initiative. The year 1942 stands as a pivotal chapter in the German-Soviet War, characterized by bold gambles, desperate struggles, and seismic shifts in momentum. For Nazi Germany, The failure to consolidate gains and the disastrous outcome at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end. For the Soviet Union, the victories of 1942 heralded a new era of resilience and resurgence, laying the groundwork for the eventual liberation of occupied territories. As the war entered its third year, the balance of power had decisively shifted, paving the way for the climactic battles that would determine the fate of Europe. The sacrifices made during this tumultuous period, and the lessons learned, would resonate throughout the remainder of the conflict, shaping the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany and the dawn of a post-war order. The Battle of Kursk, fought from July 5 to August 23, 1943, stands as one of the most decisive and iconic engagements of the German-Soviet War. It was here that the Wehrmacht launched its last major offensive on the Eastern Front, hoping to regain the initiative after the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. For the Soviet Union, Kursk represented a test of their ability to not only withstand but also decisively counter German aggression. What followed was a titanic struggle involving millions of troops, thousands of tanks, and unprecedented firepower. A battle that would reshape the course of the war and cement the Red Army's dominance on the battlefield. This chapter explores the origins, execution, and consequences of the Battle of Kursk, examining how it unfolded, the strategy employed by both sides, and its enduring significance. By early 1943, the tide of the war had begun to turn against Nazi Germany. The encirclement and destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad had dealt a severe blow to the Wehrmacht, both in terms of manpower and morale. Meanwhile, the Red Army had regained significant territory, pushing German forces back across large swathes of the Eastern Front. Despite these setbacks, Hitler remained determined to reverse the situation and reassert German supremacy. He envisioned a bold offensive aimed at cutting off the Soviet salient around Kursk, a bulge in the front lines extending westward into German-held territory. Capturing this salient would shorten the front, free up valuable reserves, and potentially pave the way for renewed attacks toward Moscow or the Caucasus. Operation Citadel, Unternehmen Citadel, as the plan was codenamed, called for a pincer movement designed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces within the Kursk salient. Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, would attack from the north, while Army Group South, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, would strike from the south. The operation relied heavily on Germany's remaining elite panzer divisions, equipped with advanced tanks like the Panther and Tiger, which were intended to punch through Soviet defenses and achieve a decisive breakthrough. However, delays plagued the preparation for Operation Citadel. Hitler's insistence on waiting for new weapons, coupled with logistical challenges and intelligence leaks, gave the Soviets ample time to fortify their positions. By the time the offensive began, the Red Army had constructed an elaborate system of defensive belts, consisting of trenches, minefields, anti-tank ditches, and bunkers. These fortifications extended to a depth of over 100 miles, creating a formidable barrier that would prove difficult for even the best-equipped German units to penetrate. Operation Citadel commenced on July 5, 1943, with a massive artillery barrage followed by coordinated assaults from both the northern and southern flanks. In the north, Ninth Army launched its attack near Orel, aiming to break through Soviet lines and link up with advancing forces from the south. However, the dense minefields and entrenched defenders quickly bogged down the assault. German tanks, including the newly introduced Panthers, struggled to navigate the rugged terrain and suffered frequent breakdowns. Soviet anti-tank guns and Katyusha rocket launchers inflicted heavy losses, forcing the attackers to retreat after minimal gains. In the south, the situation initially appeared more promising for the Germans. 4th Panzer Army, supported by the elite SS Panzer Corps, achieved significant penetrations near Prokhorovka. On July 12, the stage was set for what would become the largest tank battle in history, the clash at Prokhorovka. Over 200 tanks and self-propelled guns clashed in a chaotic melee, with T-34s and KV-1s facing off against Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinands. The fighting was brutal and close quarters, with vehicles exploding in fiery bursts and crewmen scrambling to escape burning wrecks. While the Germans managed to push forward several kilometers, they failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough, as Soviet reinforcements poured in to stabilize the line. Despite their initial successes in the south, the Germans soon found themselves mired in costly attritional warfare. The Red Army's layered defenses absorbed wave after wave of attacks, inflicting disproportionate casualties on the attackers. Moreover, the Soviets maintained numerical superiority, allowing them to rotate fresh units into combat, while the Germans exhausted their limited reserves. Recognizing the futility of continuing the offensive, Hitler ordered a halt to Operation Citadel on July 17, redirecting resources to address mounting pressures elsewhere on the Eastern Front. With the German offensive stalled, the Red Army seized the initiative. Beginning in late July, Soviet forces launched a series of counter-offensives aimed at exploiting the weakened state of the Wehrmacht. Operation Kutuzov targeted Army Group Center near Orel, while Operation Polkovodets, Rumyantsev struck at Army Group South around Kharkov. Both operations achieved remarkable success, driving German forces back and recapturing key cities. By mid-August, the Kursk salient had been eliminated, and the Red Army stood poised to advance further westward. The failure of Operation Citadel marked a turning point in the war. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had been decisively defeated in a head-to-head confrontation, shattering any lingering hopes of regaining the strategic initiative. The loss of irreplaceable tanks, aircraft, and trained personnel left the German military unable to mount another large-scale offensive on the Eastern Front. Instead, they were forced onto the defensive, retreating steadily under relentless Soviet pressure. The Battle of Kursk had far-reaching implications for both sides. For Germany, the defeat exposed the unsustainable nature of their war effort. The combination of overstretched supply lines, dwindling resources, and overwhelming Soviet resistance rendered prolonged campaigns increasingly untenable. Morale among German troops plummeted, exacerbated by the realization that the tide of the war had irreversibly turned against them. Within the high command, dissent grew louder, as generals criticized Hitler's rigid adherence to static defense and refusal to yield ground strategically. For the Soviet Union, Kursk represented a triumph of planning, preparation, and execution. The successful defense of the salient demonstrated the Red Army's growing sophistication and adaptability, particularly in the realm of combined arms operations. The integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and air power created a cohesive fighting force capable of defeating even the most elite German units. Moreover, the victory boosted civilian morale and reinforced Stalin's leadership, solidifying his image as the architect of Soviet resistance. Internationally, the outcome of Kursk bolstered Allied confidence and underscored the importance of continued cooperation between the USSR, Britain, and the United States. The Red Army's ability to absorb and repel a massive German offensive reassured Western leaders that the Soviet Union could hold its own against the Third Reich, freeing up resources for other theaters of the war. It also highlighted the need for sustained material support through programs like Lend-Lease, which provided critical aid to the Soviet war effort. Both sides emerged from Kursk with valuable lessons that shaped their strategies moving forward. For Germany, the battle underscored the limitations of blitzkrieg tactics in the face of well-prepared defenses. The reliance on armored spearheads and concentrated firepower proved less effective against deeply entrenched opponents with superior numbers. Future operations would emphasize defensive fortifications and localized counterattacks, reflecting the shift from offense to defense. For the Soviets, the success at Kursk validated the use of deep-layered defenses and elastic tactics, which allowed them to absorb enemy blows and counterattack effectively. The integration of partisan warfare, deception, and surprise also proved highly effective, providing a template for future operations. Most importantly, the Red Army's ability to adapt and innovate signaled its transformation from a beleaguered force into a formidable adversary capable of seizing the initiative. The Battle of Kursk stands as a watershed moment in the German-Soviet War, marking the definitive end of German offensive capabilities and the beginning of the Soviet march toward Berlin. For the soldiers who fought there, it was a testament to human endurance and the indomitable spirit of resistance. For historians, it serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities of modern warfare and the interplay of strategy, technology, and human will. As we move forward in our narrative, the legacy of Kursk will continue to resonate, shaping the trajectory of the war and the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany. The aftermath of the Battle of Kursk marked a decisive shift in the momentum of the German-Soviet War. With Operation Citadel decisively defeated, the Red Army seized the initiative and launched a series of relentless counteroffensives that would push German forces back across vast stretches of Soviet territory. This phase of the war, spanning from late 1943 into early 1944, represented not only a turning point on the Eastern Front, but also the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's ambitions in Eastern Europe. As the Soviets advanced westward, they employed increasingly sophisticated strategies, leveraging their numerical superiority, improved logistics, and growing experience to dismantle German defenses and reclaim lost ground. This chapter explores the key operations, battles, and strategic decisions that defined this critical period, highlighting how the Red Army transformed its earlier defensive resilience into an unstoppable offensive juggernaut. Following the failure of Operation Citadel, the Wehrmacht found itself in a precarious position. Exhausted by months of brutal fighting, German forces lacked the reserves needed to mount another large-scale offensive. Meanwhile, the Red Army had grown stronger, both in terms of manpower and material. Factories east of the Urals churned out tanks, planes, and artillery at an unprecedented rate, while reinforcements poured in from across the Soviet Union. Recognizing the opportunity to capitalize on their hard-won advantage, Soviet commanders wasted no time in launching a series of counter-offensives designed to exploit the Germans' weakened state. Operation Kutuzov, initiated on July 12, 1943, targeted Army Group Center near Orel, one of the northern pincers of the failed Kursk offensive. Spearheaded by General Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front, the operation aimed to encircle and destroy German forces holding the salient around Orel. Over the course of several weeks, Soviet armies methodically broke through German lines, using overwhelming firepower and coordinated assaults to overwhelm defenders. By August 5, Orel had been liberated, marking a significant victory for the Red Army, and further eroding German morale. Simultaneously, Operation Polkovodets, Rumyantsev was launched against Army Group South near Kharkov. Under the command of General Nikolai Vatutin, the Voronezh front sought to retake the strategically important city and drive a wedge between German forces in the south. The operation unfolded with characteristic Soviet tenacity, as infantry divisions cleared minefields and anti-tank ditches, while armored units exploited breaches in the enemy line. Despite fierce resistance from German panzer divisions, Kharkov fell on August 23, dealing another blow to the Wehrmacht and securing a vital transportation hub for future offensives. One of the defining features of the Soviet counteroffensive was its emphasis on strategic depth and methodical advances. Unlike the chaotic retreats of 1941 or the desperate defensive stands of 1942, the Red Army now operated with precision and purpose. Each operation was carefully planned, involving multiple phases and layers of coordination. Infantry units softened up enemy positions with artillery barrages and airstrikes, while engineers cleared obstacles and constructed temporary bridges to facilitate the movement of tanks and supplies. Once breakthroughs were achieved, mobile reserve formations, often consisting of elite guards units, exploited gaps in the German line, encircling and destroying isolated pockets of resistance. This approach allowed the Soviets to maintain steady pressure on the retreating Germans, preventing them from regrouping or establishing coherent defensive lines. For example, during the Smolensk offensive August-October 1943, Soviet forces liberated the city of Smolensk, a key logistical center, and advanced over 200 kilometers into previously occupied territory. Similarly, the Bryansk and Chernigov-Poltava offensives pushed German forces further west, threatening their hold on Ukraine and Belarus. The liberation of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, exemplified the effectiveness of these tactics. On November 6, 1943, elements of the First Ukrainian Front, commanded by General Ivan Konev, launched a massive assault across the Dnieper River. Using amphibious crossings and pontoon bridges, Soviet troops established bridgeheads on the western bank despite heavy German fire. Reinforced by fresh divisions and supported by air power, they expanded these footholds into full-scale penetrations, forcing the defenders to abandon the city. By November 13, Kiev was back in Soviet hands, symbolizing the resurgence of Ukrainian resistance and the collapse of German control in the region. The Dnieper River, one of Europe's largest waterways, presented a formidable obstacle for the advancing Red Army. Stretching over 2,000 kilometers, it served as a natural barrier protecting German-held territories in western Ukraine and Belarus. Crossing the river required meticulous planning, specialized equipment, and sheer determination. Yet, the Soviets executed this monumental task with remarkable efficiency, achieving what many considered impossible. Throughout September and October 1943, Soviet forces conducted a series of daring amphibious operations along the Dnieper. Engineers worked tirelessly to construct floating bridges and ferry troops and supplies across the wide expanse of water, often under intense enemy fire. In some cases, soldiers swam or paddled makeshift rafts to establish initial bridgeheads, clinging to life amidst treacherous currents and hostile conditions. Once ashore, they dug in and held their positions until reinforcements arrived, gradually expanding the beachheads into secure lodgements. The success of these crossings owed much to the Red Army's ability to adapt and innovate. Artillery units positioned on the eastern bank provided covering fire, while fighter bombers targeted German strongpoints and supply depots. Partisan fighters operating behind enemy lines disrupted communications and ambushed convoys, further weakening the already stretched German defenses. By mid-November, Soviet forces had secured multiple bridgeheads along the Dnieper, setting the stage for deeper incursions into German-occupied territory. Despite their overall success, the Soviet counteroffensives were not without challenges. The rapid pace of the advance placed immense strain on logistics, as supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers behind the front. Fuel shortages occasionally forced tank units to halt mid-operation, while ammunition stockpiles dwindled faster than they could be replenished. Harsh weather conditions also complicated matters, with autumn rains turning roads into quagmires and winter snows impeding mobility. Moreover, the Germans mounted stiff resistance wherever possible, employing scorched earth tactics to deny the Soviets access to resources and infrastructure. Entire villages were razed, crops burned, and factories dismantled, leaving little for the advancing Red Army to utilize. Civilians caught in the crossfire suffered immensely, enduring displacement, starvation, and violence at the hands of both sides. The human cost of the counteroffensive was staggering, with tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians perishing in the struggle to reclaim Soviet territory. By early 1944, the fruits of the Soviet counteroffensive became evident. Large portions of Ukraine and Belarus had been liberated, restoring Soviet sovereignty over regions that had endured years of occupation. Cities like Zhytomyr, Vinnytsia, and Mogilev returned to Soviet control, bringing relief to populations weary of Nazi rule. The liberation of these areas also bolstered Stalin's image as a liberator, reinforcing his legitimacy both domestically and internationally. In addition to territorial gains, the counteroffensive inflicted severe damage on the Wehrmacht. Entire divisions were annihilated or rendered combat ineffective, while irreplaceable equipment was lost in the chaos of retreat. Morale among German troops plummeted, exacerbated by the realization that the tide of the war had irreversibly turned against them. Within the high command, dissent grew louder, as generals criticized Hitler's rigid adherence to static defense and refusal to yield ground strategically. The liberation of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, exemplified the effectiveness of these tactics. On November 6, 1943, elements of the First Ukrainian Front, commanded by General Ivan Konev, launched a massive assault across the Dnieper River, using amphibious crossings and pontoon bridges. Soviet troops established bridgeheads on the western bank, despite heavy German fire. Reinforced by fresh divisions and supported by air power, they expanded these footholds into full-scale penetrations, forcing the defenders to abandon the city. By November 13, Kiev was back in Soviet hands, symbolizing the resurgence of Ukrainian resistance and the collapse of German control in the region. The Dnieper River, one of Europe's largest waterways, presented a formidable obstacle for the advancing Red Army, stretching over 2,000 kilometers. It served as a natural barrier protecting German-held territories in western Ukraine and Belarus. Crossing the river required meticulous planning, specialized equipment, and sheer determination. Yet, the Soviets executed this monumental task with remarkable efficiency, achieving what many considered impossible. Throughout September and October 1943, Soviet forces conducted a series of daring amphibious operations along the Dnieper. Engineers worked tirelessly to construct floating bridges and ferry troops and supplies across the wide expanse of water, often under intense enemy fire. In some cases, soldiers swam or paddled makeshift rafts to establish initial bridgeheads, clinging to life amidst treacherous currents and hostile conditions. Once ashore, they dug in and held their positions until reinforcements arrived, gradually expanding the beachheads into secure lodgements. The success of these crossings owed much to the Red Army's ability to adapt and innovate. Artillery units positioned on the eastern bank provided covering fire, while fighter bombers targeted German strongpoints and supply depots. Partisan fighters operating behind enemy lines disrupted communications and ambushed convoys, further weakening the already stretched German defenses. By mid-November, Soviet forces had secured multiple bridgeheads along the Dnieper, setting the stage for deeper incursions into German-occupied territory. Despite their overall success, the Soviet counteroffensives were not without challenges. The rapid pace of the advance placed immense strain on logistics, as supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers behind the front. Fuel shortages occasionally forced tank units to halt mid-operation, while ammunition stockpiles dwindled faster than they could be replenished. Harsh weather conditions also complicated matters, with autumn rains turning roads into quagmires and winter snows impeding mobility. Moreover, the Germans mounted stiff resistance wherever possible, employing scorched earth tactics to deny the Soviets access to resources and infrastructure. Entire villages were razed, crops burned, and factories dismantled, leaving little for the advancing Red Army to utilize. Civilians caught in the crossfire suffered immensely, enduring displacement, starvation, and violence at the hands of both sides. The human cost of the counteroffensive was staggering, with tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians perishing in the struggle to reclaim Soviet territory. By early 1944, the fruits of the Soviet counteroffensive became evident. Large portions of Ukraine and Belarus had been liberated, restoring Soviet sovereignty over regions that had endured years of occupation. Cities like Zhytomyr, Vinnytsia, and Mogilev returned to Soviet control, bringing relief to populations weary of Nazi rule. The liberation of these areas also bolstered Stalin's image as a liberator, reinforcing his legitimacy both domestically and internationally. In addition to territorial gains, the counteroffensive inflicted severe damage on the Wehrmacht. Entire divisions were annihilated or rendered combat ineffective, while irreplaceable equipment was lost in the chaos of retreat. Morale among German troops plummeted, exacerbated by the realization that the tide of the war had irreversibly turned against them. Within the high command, dissent grew louder, as generals criticized Hitler's rigid adherence to static defense and refusal to yield ground strategically. The Soviet counteroffensive from Kursk to the Dnieper had profound implications for the course of the war. For Germany, the loss of Ukraine and Belarus represented a catastrophic blow to its war effort. Not only did these regions provide vital agricultural and industrial resources, But their liberation also deprived the Third Reich of potential buffer zones against future Soviet advances. The collapse of army groups Center and South left the Wehrmacht dangerously overstretched. Unable to mount effective resistance against the Red Army's relentless pressure. For the Soviet Union, the victories of 1943-1944 heralded a new era of confidence and capability. The Red Army's ability to execute complex operations, coordinate multiple fronts, and sustain prolonged campaigns signaled its transformation into a world-class military force. Moreover, the liberation of occupied territories boosted civilian morale and solidified Stalin's authority, reinforcing his image as the architect of Soviet resistance. Internationally, the outcome of the counteroffensive bolstered Allied confidence and underscored the importance of continued cooperation between the USSR, Britain, and the United States. The Red Army's achievements reassured Western leaders that the Soviet Union could hold its own against the Third Reich, freeing up resources for other theaters of the war. It also highlighted the need for sustained material support through programs like Lend-Lease, which provided critical aid to the Soviet war effort. The Soviet counteroffensive from Kursk to the Dnieper stands as a testament to the power of resilience, innovation, and determination. What began as a defensive struggle in 1941 evolved into a triumphant march toward victory in 1943-1944, driven by the unwavering resolve of the Red Army and the Soviet people. As the war entered its final phase, the lessons learned during this period would shape the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany and the dawn of a post-war order. The sacrifices made and the victories achieved during this tumultuous chapter would resonate throughout history, serving as a powerful reminder of humanity's capacity to overcome even the darkest moments. The year 1944 marked a period of sweeping change across Eastern Europe. As the Red Army surged westward, liberating territories that had been under Nazi occupation since the early days of Operation Barbarossa. This chapter delves into the dramatic liberation campaigns that unfolded during this pivotal year, examining how the Soviet Union not only reclaimed its own lost lands but also extended its influence into neighboring states. The battles fought in the Baltics, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia were characterized by fierce resistance, shifting alliances, and complex geopolitical maneuvering. These operations reshaped the map of Eastern Europe, laying the groundwork for the post-war order while sowing the seeds of future tensions between East and West. By early 1944, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had shifted decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. The failure of German offensives at Kursk and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensives had left the Wehrmacht in retreat across much of Eastern Europe. Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of occupied territory, regardless of cost, strained German resources to the breaking point. Meanwhile, the Red Army continued to grow stronger, bolstered by reinforcements, improved logistics, and lessons learned from years of brutal combat. For Joseph Stalin, the liberation of Eastern Europe offered an opportunity to expand Soviet influence beyond the USSR's pre-war borders. As the Red Army advanced, it sought not only to defeat the Germans but also to establish pro-Soviet governments in newly liberated nations. This ambition aligned with broader Allied objectives of defeating Nazi Germany but clashed with Western concerns about Soviet hegemony in the region. Thus, the liberation campaigns of 1944 became as much about political maneuvering as they were about military conquest. One of the first major theaters of operation in 1944 was the Baltic region, where Army Group North had held out stubbornly since the early stages of Barbarossa. Encircled in the Courland pocket near Riga, tens of thousands of German troops remained isolated but defiant, tying down valuable Soviet forces. To eliminate this threat and secure the northern flank of the Eastern Front, the Red Army launched a series of offensives collectively known as the Baltic Strategic Offensive. Beginning in July 1944, Soviet forces attacked along multiple axes, overwhelming German defenses and driving deep into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Key cities such as Vilnius, Kaunas, and Tallinn fell in rapid succession, restoring Soviet control over the Baltic states. However, the fighting was far from one-sided. German units, supported by local collaborators, mounted fierce resistance, particularly in urban areas where street-to-street combat raged for days. The Estonian capital of Tallinn witnessed some of the most intense clashes, as both sides recognized its symbolic importance as a gateway to Scandinavia. Despite these challenges, the Soviets achieved their primary objectives by October 1944. While the Courland pocket remained a thorn in their side until the end of the war, the rest of the Baltic region came firmly under Soviet control. For the local populations, liberation brought mixed emotions. Many welcomed the expulsion of Nazi occupiers, but others feared the return of Soviet rule, which had often been harsh and repressive before the war. The imposition of communist regimes in the Baltics underscored the dual nature of the Red Army's advance. Liberation intertwined with domination. The liberation of Poland represented one of the most politically charged aspects of the 1944 campaigns. As the Red Army approached the country's eastern borders, hopes soared among Poles that they would finally be freed from Nazi tyranny. Yet, the reality proved far more complicated, as competing visions of Poland's future collided amidst the chaos of war. In late July 1944, Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive targeting Army Group Center in Belarusia. Within weeks, the operation achieved stunning success, annihilating entire German divisions and advancing hundreds of kilometers into Polish territory. Cities like Lublin and Białystok were liberated, and the prospect of reaching Warsaw seemed imminent. Inspired by the approaching Red Army, the Polish Home Army, a clandestine resistance movement loyal to the exiled government in London, launched the Warsaw Uprising on August 1, 1944. The uprising aimed to seize control of the city before the Soviets arrived, thereby asserting Polish sovereignty and preventing the establishment of a Soviet-backed puppet regime. However, the timing proved disastrous. Despite initial gains, the poorly armed insurgents were no match for the well-equipped German garrison, which launched a brutal counterattack. Artillery bombardments, aerial bombings, and mass executions reduced large parts of Warsaw to rubble, while civilians bore the brunt of the suffering. Compounding the tragedy was the Soviet response or lack thereof. Although Red Army units were positioned just across the Vistula River, they made no serious attempt to intervene or support the uprising. Stalin viewed the Home Army as a threat to his plans for post-war Poland and preferred to let the Germans do the dirty work of crushing them. It wasn't until January 1945, after the uprising had been brutally suppressed and Warsaw lay in ruins, that Soviet forces finally entered the city. The episode left deep scars in Polish-Soviet relations and highlighted the complexities of liberation under Stalin's shadow. Further south, the liberation of Romania and Bulgaria reflected the fluid dynamics of the war in southeastern Europe. Both countries had initially allied with Nazi Germany, contributing troops and resources to the Axis war effort. However, as the tide turned against Germany, their leaders began seeking ways to extricate themselves from the conflict. In Romania, King Michael I orchestrated a coup d'état on August 23, 1944, overthrowing the pro-German government of Ion Antonescu and declaring an armistice with the Allies. This sudden shift caught the Germans off guard, forcing them to divert precious resources to stabilize the situation. Soviet forces capitalized on the chaos, launching a swift offensive that pushed deep into Romanian territory. By early September, Bucharest had been liberated, and Romania formally switched sides, joining the fight against Germany. Bulgaria followed a similar trajectory, though with less drama. Facing mounting pressure from advancing Soviet armies, the Bulgarian government declared neutrality in late August, and subsequently severed ties with Germany. When Soviet troops crossed the Danube in early September, they encountered little resistance, allowing them to occupy key cities like Sofia without significant bloodshed. Both Romania and Bulgaria would later join the Allied coalition, providing troops and logistical support for the final push into Hungary and Austria. In Yugoslavia, the liberation campaign took on a distinctly partisan character. Led by Josip Broz, Tito's communist-led partisans. Unlike other parts of Eastern Europe, where the Red Army played the dominant role, Yugoslav resistance fighters bore the brunt of the fighting against both German occupiers and rival nationalist groups. Supported by British supplies and occasional Soviet assistance, the partisans waged a relentless guerrilla war, gradually gaining control of large swaths of the countryside. The turning point came in late 1944, when Soviet forces entered Yugoslavia from the east, linking up with Tito's troops near Belgrade. Together, they launched a coordinated assault on the city, driving out the German garrison and establishing a provisional government dominated by the partisans. While the liberation of Belgrade marked a triumph for Tito and his movement, it also foreshadowed the ethnic and political tensions that would plague post-war Yugoslavia. The forced repatriation of anti-communist Chetniks and collaborationist Croats set the stage for decades of internal strife, culminating in the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. As 1944 drew to a close, the focus of the liberation campaigns shifted to Hungary, where the remnants of Army Group South made a desperate stand to defend Budapest and the surrounding region. The Battle of Budapest, fought from October 1944 to February 1945, epitomized the ferocity of urban warfare and the determination of both sides. Surrounded by Soviet and Romanian forces, the city's defenders, including a mix of German, Hungarian, and Waffen-SS units, held out for months despite starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment. The fall of Budapest in February 1945 marked the effective collapse of organized German resistance in Hungary. With the Danube River secured and the path to Vienna open, the Red Army prepared for the final phase of the war. Yet, the human cost of the campaign was staggering. Civilians suffered immensely, caught between the brutality of the occupiers and the destruction wrought by the liberators. The legacy of the Hungarian campaign underscored the devastating toll of total war, even in the name of liberation. The liberation of Eastern Europe in 1944 transformed the geopolitical landscape of the continent, ending Nazi domination and paving the way for Soviet ascendancy in the region. For millions of people, the arrival of the Red Army meant freedom from occupation and the promise of a better future. Yet, it also heralded the imposition of authoritarian regimes and the suppression of democratic aspirations, setting the stage for the Cold War divide that would dominate global politics for decades to come. As we move forward in our narrative, the events of 1944 will continue to resonate, shaping the final battles of the German-Soviet War and the emergence of a new world order. The sacrifices made and the victories achieved during this tumultuous year serve as a testament to the resilience of humanity in the face of unimaginable adversity, and a reminder of the enduring complexities of power, ideology, and liberation. The final phase of the German-Soviet War, spanning from January to May 1945, was marked by a relentless and decisive Soviet offensive that swept across Eastern Europe and culminated in the fall of Berlin. This chapter examines the climactic battles of the war, as the Red Army raced toward the heart of Nazi Germany, while Adolf Hitler's regime teetered on the brink of collapse. The campaigns of early 1945 were characterized by overwhelming force, strategic brilliance, and a devastating human cost, as the Soviet Union sought to deliver the death blow to the Third Reich. Amidst the chaos of collapsing armies, shattered cities, and desperate last stands, the liberation of occupied territories gave way to vengeance, retribution, and the dawn of a new era. By the start of 1945, the Wehrmacht had been pushed back to the borders of the German Reich. The once mighty army that had overrun much of Europe now faced an existential crisis, its ranks depleted by years of attritional warfare and its resources stretched to the breaking point. Despite this, Hitler refused to entertain the possibility of surrender, instead issuing increasingly delusional orders for counterattacks and scorched earth policies. His fantasy of turning the tide against the Allies persisted even as reality crumbled around him. For the Soviet Union, the moment had come to deliver the final blow. With the Western Allies advancing steadily through France and into Western Germany, Stalin was determined to ensure that the Red Army would be the one to claim Berlin and dictate the terms of victory. Operation Bagration in mid-1944 had already annihilated Army Group Center, leaving German defenses in disarray. Now, with the Vistula-Oder offensive, launched in January 1945, the Soviets aimed to exploit their momentum and bring the war to a swift conclusion. The Vistula-Oder offensive, initiated on January 12, 1945, was one of the largest and most successful operations of the war. Spearheaded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front, the offensive targeted the remnants of Army Group A and Army Group Center along the Vistula River in Poland. Over 2 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft, unleashed a massive assault that overwhelmed the beleaguered German defenders. Within days, Soviet forces broke through the thin defensive lines and surged forward at astonishing speed. Key cities such as Warsaw, Lodz, and Krakow fell in rapid succession, as the Red Army advanced over 300 kilometers in less than 2 weeks. By late January, they had reached the Oder River, just 70 kilometers east of Berlin. The scale and swiftness of the advance shocked both the Germans and the Western Allies, who struggled to keep pace with the Soviet juggernaut. Despite their success, the Soviets encountered pockets of fierce resistance, particularly in urban areas where German units fought tenaciously to delay the inevitable. The battle for Poznan, for example, lasted nearly 3 weeks as defenders held out in the city's fortified citadel. Similarly, Breslau, modern-day Wrocław, became a bastion of defiance, resisting encirclement until the very end of the war. These engagements highlighted the resilience of some German units, but ultimately could not stem the tide of the Soviet advance. With the Oder River secured, the stage was set for the final assault on Berlin. For Stalin, capturing the German capital was not only a military objective but also a symbolic triumph that would cement the Soviet Union's status as the dominant power in post-war Europe. To achieve this goal, he entrusted 2 of his most capable commanders, Zhukov and Konev, with leading the operation, creating an atmosphere of intense rivalry between them. Operation Berlin, launched on April 16, 1945, involved over 2.5 million Soviet troops, 250 tanks, and 500 aircraft. Zhukov's first Belarusian front attacked from the north and east, aiming to breach the Silo Heights, a series of fortified ridges guarding the approaches to Berlin. Meanwhile, Konev's first Ukrainian front struck from the south, seeking to outflank the city and cut off potential escape routes for German forces. The competition between the 2 marshals added urgency to the operation, as each sought to claim the glory of liberating Berlin. The Battle of the Silo Heights, fought over 3 days, was among the bloodiest engagements of the final campaign. Defended by General Gotthard Heinrizi's Army Group Vistula, the heights presented a formidable obstacle, with entrenched infantry, anti-tank guns, and artillery batteries raining fire on advancing Soviet troops. Despite suffering heavy casualties, Zhukov's forces eventually broke through, thanks in part to overwhelming numbers and relentless bombardments. By April 19, the path to Berlin lay open. Inside the city, chaos reigned as civilians fled or prepared for the worst. Hitler, holed up in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issued increasingly frantic orders for non-existent reinforcements and condemned those who dared suggest retreat. The defense of Berlin was entrusted to a motley collection of regular troops, SS units, Volkssturm militias composed largely of elderly men and teenagers, and foreign collaborators. Outnumbered and outgunned, they nevertheless fought with fanatical determination, transforming the city into a labyrinth of street barricades, sniper nests, and fortified buildings. The battle for Berlin unfolded in brutal, house-to-house combat reminiscent of Stalingrad. Soviet tank columns rumbled through the streets, blasting their way past barricades and clearing resistance block by block. Infantry squads, often accompanied by flamethrowers and sappers, rooted out snipers and machine gun nests hidden in basements and rooftops. Artillery barrages and airstrikes reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble, while civilians caught in the crossfire endured unimaginable suffering. Key landmarks became focal points of the fighting. The Reichstag building, symbolizing German imperial power, was fiercely contested until Soviet soldiers silently hoisted the red banner atop its roof on April 30, a moment immortalized in propaganda photographs and later history books. Similarly, the Tiergarten district and Charlottenburg Palace saw some of the heaviest fighting, as defenders clung to every inch of ground despite overwhelming odds. Amidst the carnage, Atrocities committed by both sides cast a dark shadow over the liberation of Berlin. Soviet troops, embittered by years of war and fueled by tales of Nazi crimes, engaged in widespread looting, rape, and murder as they entered German territory. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of women were assaulted during the final months of the war, leaving deep scars on the collective psyche of the German people. While these actions cannot be excused, they must be understood within the context of the immense suffering inflicted upon the Soviet Union by Nazi aggression. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life in the Führer bunker, marking the effective end of the Third Reich. His successor, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, authorized negotiations for unconditional surrender, which were finalized on May 8, 1945, the day celebrated as Victory in Europe, VE Day. By then, Berlin lay in ruins, its population decimated and its infrastructure destroyed. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich had collapsed in scarcely 12 years, leaving behind a legacy of devastation and despair. The fall of Berlin and the subsequent defeat of Nazi Germany had profound implications for the world. For the Soviet Union, it represented the culmination of a titanic struggle that had claimed millions of lives and tested the limits of human endurance. The Red Army's triumph solidified Stalin's position as a global leader and ensured significant Soviet influence in shaping the post-war order. At the Potsdam Conference later that summer, the USSR emerged as one of the big three Allied powers, alongside the United States and Great Britain. For Germany, the consequences were catastrophic. The country was divided into occupation zones controlled by the victorious powers, setting the stage for 4 decades of Cold War division. Millions of ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe, while survivors grappled with the physical and psychological scars of total war. The Nuremberg trials, convened to prosecute Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity, underscored the moral reckoning that followed the collapse of the Third Reich. Globally, the end of the German-Soviet War signaled the beginning of a new geopolitical landscape. The wartime alliance between the USSR and the Western Allies began to fracture almost immediately, as ideological differences and competing visions for Europe's future drove a wedge between the former partners. The Iron Curtain descended across the continent, dividing East from West and ushering in an era of bipolar confrontation that would define international relations for generations to come. The final push from the Vistula to Berlin offers valuable lessons about the nature of modern warfare and the complexities of liberation. For the Soviet Union, the campaign demonstrated the power of mass mobilization, logistical planning, and combined arms operations. It also highlighted the dangers of unchecked ambition and ideological rigidity, as Stalin's determination to dominate Eastern Europe planted the seeds of future conflict. For Germany, the war's conclusion served as a stark reminder of the perils of militarism and racial hatred. The horrors of the Holocaust and the devastation wrought by Nazi policies left an indelible mark on the national conscience, prompting efforts to confront and atone for the past. Yet, the process of reconciliation and reconstruction would take decades, requiring patience, humility, and courage from all parties involved. Ultimately, the fall of Berlin stands as a testament to the resilience of humanity in the face of adversity. It is a story of sacrifice and suffering, of triumph and tragedy, and of the enduring quest for peace and justice in a fractured world. As we reflect on the events of 1945, we are reminded of the high stakes of history and the responsibility we bear to learn from it. The German-Soviet War. one of the most brutal and destructive conflicts in human history, exacted an unimaginable toll on both soldiers and civilians. This chapter delves into the harrowing experiences of those who endured the war's horrors, examining the staggering loss of life, the widespread displacement of populations, and the profound psychological scars left behind. From the battlefields where millions perished to the cities and villages reduced to rubble, the human cost of the war was immense. Yet, amidst the devastation, stories of resilience, courage, and survival emerged, testaments to the indomitable spirit of humanity in the face of overwhelming adversity. No other theater of World War II witnessed such staggering casualties as the Eastern Front. Estimates suggest that between 25 and 30 million people lost their lives during the German-Soviet War, including soldiers, civilians, and prisoners of war. The sheer scale of death defies comprehension, with entire families, communities, and generations wiped out in a matter of years. For every soldier killed in combat, countless others succumbed to starvation, disease, exposure, or execution, a grim reminder of the war's multifaceted brutality. The Red Army bore the brunt of military casualties, suffering losses that dwarfed those of any other belligerent nation. By the end of the war, over 8 million Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded, or missing in action. Many died in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, when poorly trained and equipped units were overwhelmed by the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics. Others fell victim to Hitler's policy of Kommissarbefehl, the Commissar Order, which mandated the immediate execution of captured political officers, or to the harsh conditions of German prisoner-of-war camps, where over 3 million Soviet POWs perished due to neglect, malnutrition, and systematic extermination. On the German side, the losses were equally devastating. By May 1945, approximately 5 million Wehrmacht soldiers had been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner on the Eastern Front. The final months of the war saw some of the highest casualty rates, as desperate last stands and chaotic retreats claimed tens of thousands of lives. Elite units like the Waffen-SS and Panzer divisions, once regarded as invincible, were decimated in futile attempts to hold back the Soviet tide. Civilians suffered disproportionately, caught between two merciless forces. Nazi occupation policies were marked by extreme violence and exploitation, targeting Jews, Slavs, Roma, and other groups deemed racially inferior. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads operating behind the front lines, murdered over 1 million people in mass shootings alone. In addition to these atrocities, forced labor programs deported millions of Soviet citizens to Germany, where they endured appalling conditions in factories and farms. Soviet reprisals against collaborators and suspected traitors added to the civilian death toll. Partisan warfare, while effective in disrupting German supply lines, often led to brutal reprisals against local populations. Entire villages were burned to the ground, and their inhabitants executed en masse in retaliation for guerrilla attacks. The scorched earth tactics employed by retreating German forces further compounded the suffering, leaving behind barren landscapes devoid of food, shelter, or infrastructure. The war displaced tens of millions of people across Eastern Europe, creating one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. As the front lines shifted back and forth, civilians fled advancing armies, seeking safety in distant towns or foreign countries. Those unable to escape faced dire circumstances, enduring sieges, bombardments, and occupations that left them vulnerable to starvation, disease, and violent. The siege of Leningrad exemplifies the plight of besieged populations. Over 800,000 residents perished from hunger, cold, and bombardment during the 72-day blockade, while survivors resorted to eating pets, wallpaper paste, and even human flesh to survive. Similar scenes played out in other besieged cities, such as Stalingrad and Warsaw, where urban warfare turned neighborhoods into killing zones and civilians into collateral damage. Beyond individual cities, the war devastated entire regions. Ukraine, often referred to as the breadbasket of Europe, became a wasteland under German occupation. Villages were razed, crops confiscated, and livestock slaughtered, plunging millions into famine. Belarus fared no better, with over half its pre-war population either killed or displaced. Forests and fields became battlegrounds, littered with unexploded ordnance and the remains of fallen soldiers. Industrial centers also bore the brunt of destruction. Factories, railroads, and power plants were deliberately targeted by both sides, crippling the economies of affected nations. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945, though carried out by Allied forces, underscored the indiscriminate nature of total war, reducing a thriving cultural hub to ashes and claiming tens of thousands of civilian lives. Such acts of destruction reinforced the notion that no corner of Europe was safe from the war's reach. For those who survived, the war left deep psychological scars that lingered long after the guns fell silent. Soldiers returning home struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, haunted by memories of comrades lost and atrocities witnessed. Many suffered from what would later be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and emotional numbness. Veterans organizations provided some support, but stigma and lack of understanding often prevented individuals from seeking help. Civilians, too, grappled with the trauma of displacement, loss, and violence. Women who had endured sexual violence at the hands of occupying forces faced societal ostracism and shame, compounding their suffering. Children orphaned by the war grew up in institutions or foster care, deprived of parental guidance and stability. Intergenerational transmission of trauma meant that the effects of the war continued to reverberate through families and communities for decades. Collective memory of the war varied widely depending on geography and ideology. In the Soviet Union, the conflict was commemorated as the Great Patriotic War, a narrative emphasizing heroism, sacrifice, and ultimate victory. Monuments, museums, and annual parades celebrated the triumph of socialism over fascism, while dissenting voices were suppressed. In contrast, West Germany initially sought to distance itself from the Nazi past, focusing instead on economic recovery and integration into Western alliances. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that public discourse began to confront the full extent of German complicity in wartime crimes. Eastern European nations occupied a more ambiguous position, torn between gratitude for liberation from Nazi rule and resentment over Soviet domination. The imposition of communist regimes following the war created new grievances. As freedoms were curtailed and opposition crushed, memories of the war thus became entangled with broader struggles for national identity and self-determination. Despite the overwhelming darkness of the war, stories of resilience and survival offer glimpses of hope. Ordinary citizens displayed extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable hardship. In Leningrad, Artists and musicians performed symphonies and plays in bomb shelters, preserving culture and morale despite the siege. In Warsaw, members of the Home Army risked their lives to document Nazi atrocities and smuggle reports to the outside world. Women played crucial roles on the home front, managing households, caring for children, and contributing to the war effort. Factory workers labored tirelessly to produce munitions and supplies, while nurses and doctors tended to the wounded under perilous conditions. In rural areas, peasants shared scarce resources with neighbors and hid fugitives from persecution, demonstrating remarkable solidarity in times of crisis. Particularly inspiring are the accounts of Holocaust survivors who defied incredible odds to rebuild their lives. Whether through hiding, fleeing, or resisting, these individuals refused to succumb to despair. Their testimonies serve as powerful reminders of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of remembering the past to prevent future atrocities. The human cost of the German-Soviet War is a sobering testament to the capacity for destruction inherent in modern warfare. Millions of lives were irrevocably altered, if not extinguished, by the clash of ideologies and the pursuit of territorial conquest. The imposition of communist rule sparked widespread resistance, particularly in Poland and Hungary. In 1956, anti-Soviet uprisings erupted in both nations, fueled by demands for greater autonomy and reforms. While Polish leader Władysław Gomułka managed to negotiate limited concessions from Moscow, the Hungarian Revolution was brutally crushed by Soviet tanks, leaving thousands dead and reinforcing the perception of Soviet hegemony as immutable. Yugoslavia represented a unique case within the Eastern Bloc. Under Josip Broz Tito, the country maintained a degree of independence from Moscow, pursuing a policy of non-alignment during the Cold War. However, this autonomy came at a cost, as Stalin severed ties with Yugoslavia in 1948, labeling Tito a traitor and subjecting the country to economic blockades and diplomatic isolation. In addition to redrawing borders and restructuring governments, the Allies sought to hold accountable those responsible for the atrocities committed during the war. The Nuremberg trials, held between November 1945 and October 1946, represented the first international effort to prosecute individuals for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. 24 high-ranking Nazi officials, including Hermann Göring, Albert Speer, and Rudolf Hess, stood trial before an international military tribunal composed of judges from the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. The proceedings revealed the full extent of Nazi atrocities, documenting evidence of mass murder, forced labor, medical experiments, and other horrors perpetrated in concentration camps and occupied territories. 12 defendants were sentenced to death. 7 received prison terms, and 3 were acquitted. While the trials were criticized for being victor's justice, given that Allied powers themselves had committed acts of questionable legality, they nonetheless established important precedents for international law and human rights. Subsequent trials focused on lower-level officials, military officers, and industrialists who had facilitated the Nazi regime's crimes. The Einsatzgruppen trial, part of the larger subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, specifically addressed the actions of mobile killing squads responsible for murdering hundreds of thousands of Jews, Roma, and other victims. These efforts underscored the Allies' commitment to confronting the past, even as geopolitical considerations sometimes overshadowed moral imperatives. The political aftermath of the German-Soviet War laid the foundation for the Cold War, a prolonged period of ideological, economic, and military competition between the capitalist West and the communist East. The division of Europe into opposing blocs reflected the irreconcilable differences between the United States and the Soviet Union, whose wartime alliance gave way to mutual suspicion and hostility. Key events in the late 1940s accelerated the descent into Cold War. The Berlin blockade of 1948-1949, during which the Soviet Union cut off road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, prompted a massive airlift operation by the Western Allies to supply the isolated city. The formation of NATO in 1949 and the Warsaw Pact in 1955 institutionalized the military divide, creating rival alliances poised for conflict. Meanwhile, proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere extended the struggle beyond Europe, transforming local disputes into battlegrounds for global supremacy. For Eastern Europe, the post-war order meant decades of authoritarian rule and economic stagnation. The absence of political freedoms, coupled with centralized planning and censorship, stifled innovation and dissent. Yet, beneath the surface, discontent simmered, eventually erupting in movements like Solidarity in Poland and the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. These uprisings demonstrated the resilience of democratic ideals and the enduring desire for self-determination among oppressed peoples. The political aftermath of the German-Soviet War reshaped the map of Europe and redefined the global balance of power. The division of Germany and the rise of Soviet satellite states exemplified the competing visions of the future held by the Allies, while the Nuremberg trials sought to confront the moral failures of the past. Together, these developments set the stage for a new chapter in history, one marked by both progress and peril. As we reflect on the legacy of this transformative period, we are reminded of the fragility of peace and the importance of vigilance in safeguarding human rights and democratic values. The lessons of the post-war era continue to resonate today, offering guidance as we navigate the challenges of an increasingly interconnected world. The German-Soviet War, a cataclysmic conflict that claimed tens of millions of lives and reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe, left an indelible mark on history. Its legacy is multifaceted, encompassing military innovation, political realignment, and profound moral reckoning. This final chapter examines the enduring lessons of the war, both for the nations directly involved and for humanity as a whole. It explores how the war influenced subsequent conflicts, shaped collective memory, and continues to inform our understanding of warfare, ideology, and human resilience. By reflecting on these lessons, we gain insight into the forces that have shaped the modern world, and the responsibilities we bear to prevent such tragedies from recurring. The German-Soviet War was a crucible of military innovation, forcing both sides to adapt and evolve in response to unprecedented challenges. The early successes of Operation Barbarossa demonstrated the devastating potential of blitzkrieg tactics, rapid, coordinated assaults combining armor, infantry, and air power. Yet, as the war progressed, the limitations of this approach became evident, particularly when faced with vast distances, harsh weather, and determined resistance. For the Soviet Union, the war prompted a transformation in military doctrine and organization. The Red Army learned to combine mobility with defensive depth, employing layered fortifications, elastic tactics, and counter-offensive maneuvers to wear down superior opponents. The integration of partisan warfare behind enemy lines added another dimension to their strategy, disrupting supply chains and sowing chaos among Axis forces. These adaptations not only turned the tide of the war but also influenced post-war military thinking, emphasizing the importance of flexibility, logistics, and combined arms operation. On the German side, the failure to achieve decisive victories highlighted the dangers of overextension and underestimation. Hitler's insistence on rigid adherence to static defense and unrealistic objectives undermined the Wehrmacht's effectiveness, while his micromanagement alienated experienced commanders. The lessons of Stalingrad, Kursk, and other battles underscored the need for strategic coherence and operational flexibility, a principle that would guide Western militaries during the Cold War and beyond. The war also accelerated advancements in technology and weaponry. Tanks like the Soviet T-34 and German Tiger became iconic symbols of armored warfare, while jet aircraft and guided missiles heralded the dawn of a new era in aerial combat. The development of nuclear weapons, spurred by wartime research, introduced existential stakes to international relations, forever altering the calculus of power and deterrence. The political consequences of the German-Soviet War extended far beyond the battlefield, reshaping the global order and fueling ideological struggles that defined the second half of the 20th century. The division of Germany and the establishment of Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe created fault lines that persisted until the collapse of the USSR in 1991. The Iron Curtain, symbolizing the divide between capitalism and communism, became a defining feature of the Cold War, shaping alliances, proxy wars, and diplomatic negotiation. For the Soviet Union, victory over Nazi Germany cemented its status as a superpower and legitimized Stalin's regime domestically and internationally. However, the imposition of communist rule in Eastern Europe bred resentment and resistance, undermining claims of liberation and fostering long-term instability. The eventual unraveling of Soviet hegemony from Hungary in 1956 to Poland in 1989 revealed the fragility of authoritarian regimes built on coercion rather than consent. In contrast, the United States emerged from the war as a champion of democracy and free markets, leveraging its economic might and moral authority to promote reconstruction and recovery in Western Europe. Initiatives like the Marshall Plan and the formation of NATO reflected a commitment to collective security and prosperity, countering Soviet expansionism through soft power as well as hard power. Yet, the idealism of these efforts often clashed with pragmatic considerations, leading to controversial interventions in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere. The ideological rivalry between East and West also had profound implications for decolonization and the global South. Newly independent nations found themselves courted or coerced by competing blocs seeking influence and resources. Non-aligned movements, inspired by figures like Jawaharlal Nehru, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Josip Broz Tito, sought to chart a third path, advocating for self-determination and neutrality in the face of superpower competition. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the German-Soviet War lies in its moral dimensions, the atrocities committed, the suffering endured, and the responsibility to remember and learn. The Holocaust, perpetrated alongside the war's military campaigns, stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazis, were systematically murdered in concentration camps, ghettos, and mass executions. The scale and brutality of these crimes shocked the conscience of the world, prompting calls for accountability and vigilance against hatred and intolerance. Efforts to confront this legacy took many forms. The Nuremberg trials established legal precedents for prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity, laying the groundwork for institutions like the International Criminal Court. Memorial sites at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Dachau, and Treblinka serve as poignant reminders of the horrors of genocide, attracting millions of visitors each year who come to pay tribute and reflect on the past. Yet, memory is never neutral. In Russia, the Great Patriotic War has been mythologized as a triumph of socialism over fascism, overshadowing uncomfortable truths about Stalin's complicity in enabling Hitler's rise and his brutal treatment of Soviet citizens. Similarly, debates over collaboration versus resistance continue to shape national identities in countries like Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states, complicating efforts to build shared narratives of reconciliation. For Germany, grappling with the Nazi past required decades of introspection and reform. The process began haltingly, with denazification programs giving way to economic miracles and cultural renewal. Over time, initiatives like Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik and Angela Merkel's acknowledgement of German guilt fostered greater understanding and cooperation with former adversaries. Today, Germany serves as a model of democratic governance and humanitarian leadership, demonstrating the possibilities of redemption and renewal. The German-Soviet War offers timeless lessons about the perils of unchecked ambition, ideological extremism, and dehumanization. It reminds us that wars are fought not only on battlefields but also in hearts and minds, where fear, prejudice, and propaganda can sow the seeds of conflict. To prevent future tragedies, we must remain vigilant against the forces that seek to divide us. Racism, nationalism, and authoritarianism, and uphold the values of equality, justice, and solidarity. Education plays a crucial role in this endeavor. By teaching younger generations about the causes and consequences of the war, we empower them to recognize warning signs and advocate for peace. Museums, memorials, and educational programs ensure that stories of survival and sacrifice are preserved, inspiring empathy and action. International cooperation is equally vital. Institutions like the United Nations, NATO, and the European Union embody the principles of multilateralism and collective security that arose from the ashes of World War II. While imperfect, these frameworks provide mechanisms for resolving disputes, addressing crises, and promoting sustainable development. Strengthening them requires sustained commitment from governments, civil society, and individuals alike. Finally, the war underscores the resilience of the human spirit. From soldiers fighting for freedom to civilians enduring unimaginable hardships, countless acts of courage and compassion illuminated even the darkest moments. These stories remind us that, no matter how dire the circumstances, hope endures, and with it, the possibility of rebuilding and renewing. The legacy of the German-Soviet War is a testament to the complexities of history and the enduring quest for meaning in the face of tragedy. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, honor those who suffered, and strive for a better future. As we look back on this pivotal period, we are reminded of the high cost of war and the imperative of peace. The sacrifices made and the lessons learned during those tumultuous years serve as guiding lights, urging us to cherish our shared humanity and work together toward a world free from the scourge of conflict. With this reflection, we conclude our exploration of the German-Soviet War, a story of devastation and defiance, of loss and liberation, and ultimately, of hope amidst despair. May it inspire us to build bridges where there are divides, to seek justice where there is injustice, and to honor the past by shaping a brighter tomorrow.